Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural Custody Insights webinar. This is the first of a series of webinars which the Federation Custody Group are looking to hold, and today's topic concerns pressures in custody. Now, first of all, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that I'm not Paul Williams. Hopefully, you're not too disappointed with that. Regrettably, Paul, who is the lead from the National Board for Custody Issues, has had to step away this morning for an urgent case conference call that he really had to take. So I've stepped in to help with today's event, but thankfully I'm ably assisted by JJ Jackson here.
Thank you. James Jackson, so I'm a custody officer down in the Met, but I also am one of the leads one of the chairs for the National Custody Forum within the Federation. It's a practitioner-led work group that works to try and assist with providing best practice and raising national concerns in custody. We work with our speakers that are here today, so Chris Bath and Anton Menzies are two of the many organisations that sort of work collaboratively with us on that focus group or that protection group.
Thanks, JJ. So as you'll have seen from the agenda, folks, and as JJ just mentioned there, we've got two guest speakers assisting with the webinar today, both experts in their own right. You'll hear more from them and a better introduction when they come to speak. But we've got Chris Bath, the Chief Executive of the National Appropriate Adults Network. And we're also joined by Anton Menzies, the Senior Policy Manager for Custody Issues over there at the College of Policing. Now, the benefit, the value of a model such as this webinar is the engagement with yourselves, practitioners, members, work-based reps, and other colleagues in the custody area that have joined us today, or maybe watching online in a catch-up sense. And so hearing from you really adds value and brings content to what we're going to be discussing today. So if you do have any questions for our speakers today, questions generally that maybe could be taken away and answered back in slow time, then please drop them into the chat as a written question, or alternatively email us at the address you see, events@polfed.org. on the screen, or thirdly, scan the QR code, and that'll give you a quick link to a question platform where you can submit your questions. We'll get them here in the studio, and we'll bring them and feed them in to content as we go along. I would ask, Teams is becoming a very popular platform in much of the work that we do, and it's commonplace to perhaps raise your hand and hope you'll be brought into the conversation. Because of the numbers involved in a webinar like this, we'd ask you to avoid doing that if you could, please, and instead, as we've said, pop your questions into the chat or the other methods that we've spoken about. Right, so perhaps without further ado, if we move on to our first item on our agenda, the National Developments on Appropriate Adults. And for this, we're going to be bringing in Chris Bath, as we said, and Chris is the Chief Executive of the Appropriate Adults Network. Hopefully you can see Chris on the screen there. So Chris, over to you, please.
Morning. Morning, everybody. I'll start by saying thank you for your service, and thank you for giving up your time this morning as well. I'm conscious that with these events, I'm always engaging with the best of custody. It's a self-selecting group of people who are able to make the time in a very busy role to come to these things and involve themselves in the discussions about improving custody. So I'm really grateful for that. And also thank you to the Federation, obviously, for the opportunity to speak to you, and particularly for trusting me with the first one, which I didn't realise was the case until just that introduction. So I hope it's a decent starter for TEM. And finally, an apology for PowerPoint fans in that I don't have any, so you're going to have to mostly look at me for the next 20 minutes. So I am the Chief Executive of an organisation called the National Appropriate Adult Network, which I'll mention a little bit more about in a second, but I'm also on the PACE strategy board. those two roles are things that I've been doing for 12 years in March, which is either really impressive or indicative of the fact that nobody else will give me a job. And I'm now holding on to the claim to fame that Chief Constable Nev Kemp, who recently stood down from leading the NPCC custody portfolio, said in his leaving address that he knew it was time to move on from the portfolio when Chris Bath from Nairn started visiting him in the night. In his dreams, I hasten to add, not in reality. So hopefully we've had some impact on the leadership of custody, and I stand by the fact it's an incredibly important and often sort of disrespected role in policing, and it needs that leadership to support those who are doing the work. So our organisation, National Appropriate Adult Network, or NAN for short, which is, as we've just established in our intro before you came on, is always a bit of a giggle from the kind of curry perspective and a bit of a laugh on a night out when we go to the curry house. We are the National Appropriate Adult Network. You can look us up at appropriateadult.org.uk. I do recommend Googling Appropriate Adult rather than NAN, so you actually get a chance of finding us. We're a registered charity, and I think the quick way of explaining it is that we're kind of the centre of expertise on the appropriate adult role nationally. So we're not a provider. We support a network of around 100 organisations. We provide practical advice and resources, so supporting that frontline work, if you like. And then on the other hand, we're providing a voice for appropriate adults in all the many national decisions and discussions that kind of go on. So, it's a bit like rolling the NPCC, the college, the Fed, HMI, Police Foundation, kind of all rolled into one, but with 3 members of staff and no office. But really important to us is that we are a membership organisation. So pretty much every single appropriate adult scheme in England and Wales will be a member of ours, and some further afield as well. Some police forces actually members. Off the top of my head, Hampshire, I think Leicestershire, a few police and crime commissioners now, MOPAC in London, Merseyside, Staffordshire, Warwickshire. So yeah, membership is open to forces and individuals if that's of interest to you. So sales pitch over. I'm not going to use this opportunity to try and do some kind of refresher course on the appropriate adult role. I don't want to get bogged down in that, and many of you will be familiar with it, and we'll talk about a video a bit later on that you can use in custody, and that may be of help as well. But obviously it's important to us that people do understand the breadth of the appropriate adult role, and in 12 years of talking with custody sergeants, it's very clear that the level of training, and abstractions from operational time to get that training or to do the self-learning is very difficult. So yeah, it's just worth kind of, I think, reminding ourselves that they are there to safeguard the interests of these 2 groups, children and then vulnerable adults, and that this isn't just they're the well-meaning do-gooders who sit in the back of the interview room and maybe help a bit with understanding questions. It's quite a broad role, as described in Code C 1.7a, that wraps in, helping people to understand their rights and supporting them during procedures, but also, and of course, issues of welfare and effective communication, but also making sure that people's rights are respected and followed. So what we're trying to achieve, what the system's trying to achieve with appropriate adults is people get treated fairly, they can participate effectively. Obviously, there's compliance with PACE. So I always think about it in this way. On one hand, obviously, you're completely on the side of the person that you're supporting, but what you're doing by doing that is balancing out the kind of seesaw of all of justice, because yes, you're trying to avoid miscarriages of justice, and trying to avoid investigations going kind of down the wrong route. At the same time, and I learned this by spending about 5 days with a group of activists who themselves have experienced policing, criminal justice, as well as kind of mental health, learning disabilities from across the world. People don't actually want to be treated through a completely different system. What they want is a system that adapts to their needs, and if they should be held accountable for something, then they should be held accountable for it. And the appropriate adult role is part of adjusting that role to meet those people needs. So on one hand, it's miscarriage of justice and sort of helping people not get prosecuted when they ought not to be, but equally it's about making sure that the broadest possible group of people can go through the process. And if that means an out of court disposal, if that means prosecution, then that's what it is. But it's done fairly, and it means that the evidence is admissible. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of put that out there, because I know that there isn't always the time to think about these things in the broader sense, and it can become part of the process, and it can become a bit of a tick box thing, and it can become unclear what their kind of function and role is. What I'd like to spend a little bit more time about is talking about the kind of national picture, which is the thing that I'm lucky enough to kind of have an oversight of. And again, I'm conscious from lots of conversations that I've had locally with custody teams that what the appropriate adult world looks like depends on where you are and what kind of services you've got. So people will talk about the appropriate adult service because that's the provider in their area, as if that's a national thing. So I think it's worthwhile just talking about provision for children, provision for vulnerable adults, so that we understand what that looks like at a kind of wider level. Our membership, which reflects largely appropriate adult provision, varies at local level. So you've got some public sector delivery, you've got some private sector delivery, you've got charitable organisations delivering, you've got some schemes that are in-house. So the Youth Justice Service does it itself, or Adult Social Services does it itself. Other ones that are commissioned out to the private or charitable sectors. You've got provision that happens in hours. You've got schemes that only work out of hours. You've got various commissioners, which we'll kind of come on to. You've got AAs that are volunteers. You've got AAs that are paid staff, employees. You've got AAs that are sessional staff, and any mix of those. So you've got charities using paid sessional staff. You've got the private sector running volunteer schemes. It's a really, really mixed bag. Unlike things like independent custody visitors, which are always volunteers and always run by the Police and Crime Commissioner, it's a much more variable picture with appropriate adults. So yeah, the people that you're going to come across, depending where you are and in hours, out of hours, are going to vary, which you know locally you see, but also moving between forces would be really different. Okay, I'm just going to give my perspective on what I think some of the challenges are, particularly thinking about what your perspective might be on this, and then maybe in questions and discussions you can tell me if I'm horribly wrong, or if you think I've got it right from your perspective. And I appreciate it's different for different forces, but the first challenge that I would pick up on is identifying vulnerability as defined by PACE, particularly post 2018 when the codes changed and we got a new paragraph 1.4, a new paragraph 1.13d, a new definition of vulnerability, and new thresholds and new demands on custody officers. Historically, we've had really low rates of identification. When I started doing this work and getting data from forces, 2.7% of adult detentions were recorded as needing an AA. We're now up to, well, the last data was 2023, so it's a couple of years old now. End of February, we'll get the new data, but that was 8.7%. So we've gone from sort of 3% to 9% in about a decade. But there's also data out there. There's some data for one force, I'm not sure if I'm able to say, but in the Northeast, which indicates like over 60% of adult detentions in police custody having a diagnosable mental disorder, for example, which is only one of the sort of areas of concern in relation to who needs an AA. So we've got a big gap between what we're currently identifying and servicing and potentially what might need to be. And behind that is, I think, a lack of tools, a lack of training. I think PACE changed and not a lot happened in terms of supporting people to identify it. And when I talk to people about what level of training they've had about it, it's not huge. And so we get massive variances between forces. So some forces 22% being identified, other forces 2%, 3%. The next one is lack of AA availability. You've got, particularly at certain pinch points, out of hours, getting a fast response time for initial rights and entitlements, strip searches. We've had these discussions about welfare searches, and that being where the line is between asking someone if they need to change their clothes because they're freezing, or using a police power to remove clothing for welfare purposes. Of course, some areas have no organised provision for adults. Demands going up for those schemes, particularly for adults, in part because you're getting a lot better at identifying that vulnerability, and you're getting rightly more demanding on AAs attending and to protect the person's rights throughout the detention episode. We've also seen an increased use in voluntary interview, which maybe takes a little bit of pressure off custody, but it has its own set of challenges around how the logistics of how you kind of service that. Whether people turn up is one of them. And then also the coverage of detention by appropriate adults. So from what I can see, average detention times for children are something like 10.5 hours now. I think AAs are broadly attending for about 2.5 hours out of that, about a quarter, which presents real challenges. Are they coming for rights and entitlements? Are they staying for charge, bail, out of court outcomes, those sorts of things? From the scheme perspective, you see massive difficulty recruiting, post-COVID volunteering falling through the floor, low pay. I mean, the sessional workers are on minimum wage as AAs. You would genuinely have seen adverts for cleaning the floor in Aldi that are better paid than being an appropriate adult. We've got quite a variety in terms of quality. There's no mandatory training course for appropriate adults. In fact, technically you don't need to do any training at all, although all of our members would be providing some kind of training, but even that is quite variable. You've got parents and family members without any training relying on you to explain kind of what the role is. Massive lack of funding, huge pressures on the sector, demand going up, no link back to funding. Some of this might sound quite familiar to you. Big variances in the level of funding between different areas. And increased expectations about coming earlier and staying longer. Now on the children's side, we things are a little bit simpler because there's a statutory duty. Your obviously PACE requirement is to secure the appropriate adult, but you're not allowed to provide them. The AAs cannot be under the control and direction or contractual arrangements to the chief officer. So somebody else has got to provide them. And for children, that's relatively simple. You can at least point a finger if the service is not where it needs to be. For example, 24/7, because the local authority has a statutory duty under the Crime and Disorder Act. We now have, I'm really pleased to say, HMI, probation, youth justice inspections, including AA's services for the first time ever this year, which means there's an inspection and accountability thing. There'll be reports that say whether provision is good enough for children. On the adult side, we've got a lack of statutory provision, and PACE is quite old now, 1984, and no one's ever been statutorily responsible providing AAs for vulnerable adults when you need them. A lot of local authorities have just walked away from that. A lot of PCCs have kind of been forced to step into that gap. I think now half of force areas depend on PCCs for the provision of appropriate adults, are mostly commissioned. There's no inspection of AAs. It's a major challenge, and frankly, if we look at the issue of 60% of people needing an AA, we probably need to go beyond just thinking about funding AAs, because basically nobody's ever going to fund that amount of demand, and think about why the hell 60% of people in the custody suites are mentally ill. What's failing upstream in terms of other public services that are leaving police holding the baby and a massive amount of risk. So nationally, then, we're working on the statutory provision issue. Wrote to the policing minister about it last week. It's been a long, hard slog. You don't change the law easily. There is probably money attached to this, which makes it more difficult. But until we get statutory provision, it's very difficult for you and for us to point a finger at who's responsible for providing those services. We're actively working with commissioners to try and make sure that they do good specifications, that they understand that it should be 24/7, that they understand that AA should come quickly and stay for long periods of time. We have been working with the NPCC, our working group, to try and drive a kind of national risk assessment or some sort of tool that would help people. If you ask these questions, the computer doesn't tell you what to do, but if you ask these questions, it indicates yes AA, no AA. Then you're kind of covered. You can explain why an AA was used or not used. And we've just launched a national training course for appropriate adults as well. So we're hoping to kind of standardise the quality, if you like, of appropriate adults. I did just want to briefly also just flag up a couple of things on our website that I think might be interesting to you. So this is our website. Hopefully you can see that, appropriateadult.org.uk. And kind of right at the start, you see this pretty big video here. If you go to information and then for family or other supporters, you'll see a couple of things. One is a video, which about 10, 12 forces are using now. This is a 9-minute video that is sent to or shared with on site family AAs to help them understand what the role is, taking the pressure off colleagues in policing to explain what the role is. You'll see a link here. Can my organisation use this video? And the answer is yes. There's a poster in there as well that with a QR code you can pop up in reception or in custody, and people can scan, and the video's online so they can just access that. You'll also see some written guides that you can print and hand out. We've recently got the Home Office to update the 2003 guidance that they had for you to give out to AAs. That's now updated. There's a gov.uk page. If you just go on gov.uk and put in appropriate adults, you'll find this being an appropriate adult. So there's new information, which links back to our video and written guide. So they're the official kind of guidance that you can just print out and give. And a lot of forces have had a lot of success just, showing that video. It kind of really hopefully explains things. The other thing that I wanted to point out to you that I thought might be quite interesting on our site, if you scroll down, it's sort of hidden away in policy vulnerability, but you can see it from the front page. We've got a series of videos which are specifically designed for police officers, also HCPs, also liaison diversion. And as a set of 3 free videos, are about 10 minutes each, that explain what PACE vulnerability is, how it's defined in law, and how you work together with HCPs and liaison and diversion to identify and action it. So again, that's just a thing that I thought might be of interest to you. The last one I would point out is standards. So there is a set of official national standards for appropriate adults. So if you're wondering, is the force accessing a service that kind of meets all the standards, you can go and have a look at that. And they're authorised by a variety of organisations. You can download them from here. They come as a kind of PDF document, but there's like 60 pages of quite, even more actually, 98 pages of pretty detailed standards. So I am coming to the end of my time. What I would briefly say, if I can just beg an extra minute or so of your time, is what I would like from you. I think the role that you have is incredibly highly skilled. I think you're holding massive risks. I don't think it's always understood or respected, even by other parts of your own organisations. I'd like to see you demand the time to understand PACE vulnerability, demand the tools to identify it. I see your role as kind of being the guardians of justice. You're independent from the investigation. Lots of these things don't even go to court. So whether justice is followed is really up to the custody team in a big way. And so I guess I'd make a plea, because I know what's happening. The services for AAs aren't there. You're between a rock and a hard place, and you're kind of triaging vulnerability, and you're making a distinction, which is not in PACE, between who's vulnerable and who actually kind of gets an AA given the limited demand. And I guess what I would encourage is the longer you do that for, the less evidence there is that more is needed. And I understand why it's difficult, but I would also, with Section 38(6) local authority transfers, just ask for what you need and demand it. And if you're not getting an AA at 9 o'clock at night when you need to do a strip search, escalate it and make sure that there are systems to escalate it so that you're not holding the risk and a child or a vulnerable adult's not in handcuffs for multiple hours awaiting an AA for a strip search, which is a number of cases we've had recently. And I'd ask you to make demands of the appropriate adults kind of provision, at the same time respect and facilitate their rights. So give them access to the full custody record, listen to them when they're concerned about fitness for interview, back up the AA that's kind of irritating the OIC by pausing an interview because they're concerned about the person's ability to involve themselves. Involve the AAs in reviews of detention, even if they haven't worked out that they should be pushing for it. Respect the pressures that they're under. We're not on the same side in many senses, but we are all in the same boat. And I think both sides can do better. And I think we've got a shared interest when it comes to justice. And I think it's going to take both sides to make that work. So communicate clearly with them, expedite the cases that involve AAs to the extent that you can, refuse detention when the grounds aren't made out by the arresting officer. So be tough and have high expectations of AAs, but also understand they're under similar kinds of pressures that you are, and the whole of public service is, which is there's just way more demand from the amount of resources. So I look forward to questions and a bit of a chat later on. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. That was very informative stuff. Before we hand over to JJ, just to take through questions that we may have received, I think it's worth noting individual custody officers or operators in that custody space, feeling empowered to gather the evidence that you're talking about, gather the data around where the lack of service and provision is, and doing the right thing and making it work on the night is what, invariably is what we do. But I absolutely take the point that perhaps gathering that data and escalating it just helps inform the broader picture. And any custody operators out there that don't perhaps feel they've got the time or the inclination, they're banging their head on a brick wall, having repeatedly raised the same issues, use your Fed reps as well, use your custody Fed reps out there, use us as a voice for this specialist area to help articulate and advance the data. Because as we know in Fed circles, anecdotal isn't as strong as data driven. We've got the actual data behind what we're trying to say. More doors are opened up to us, so we can certainly help with that. JJ.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I work with you, so I know how passionate you are around this subject. So thank you for coming today and presenting. I've got a couple of questions. I just wanted to say on that though. So each force has a local custody lead, and then there's a regional custody lead for each area, and we all link in with each other as part of the custody forum. So if you are getting issues, then feel free to pass that over to your local leads, and it will come back to us in the custody forum, and we can speak to Chris, and we can pass that information over, and we work together quite well.
Just add to that as well. There's a really interesting thing that I've noticed about policing, which is that you're just problem solvers, and when everybody else steps back, you step forward. And in the middle of a terrorist attack, that's great. When it comes to a failure of social services, it just allows everybody else to step back. So I think that the focus here is what data can policing is to get good at identifying vulnerability and calling AAs. That's its role. What policing doesn't need to step into is starting to solve the problem of the AA provision, which we've started to see in a couple of places where officers responsible for custody have been tasked with sort of setting up AA schemes, and that's actually sort of contrary to PACE, aside from the time and resourcing that takes away from their actual function. And I think one of the challenges for policing is if you're busy doing everybody else's job, you don't have the time to do your job, and then you get it in the neck for not doing your job. And I think that's there's a real line in the sand that we need to hold.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. The only question we've had at the moment, or the only question we've got at the moment is, so what do you see the current challenges working with AAs in custody? What are the sort of burning issues that you're aware of at the moment?
So whether there's an appropriate adult service available is the key one. I think there's a really interesting thing about what the kind of complaint that we hear the most from our members would be, it's all rush until I get to the suite. They demand me to come really quickly, and then I get to the suite and suddenly time slows down and nothing really happens, and I'm just kind of sat around. And I think that's a little bit more complicated than it sounds. It sounds like they're being treated unfairly. I think there is something about making sure cases are expedited, but obviously if you expedite one case, you're not expediting another case, so that's a challenge. So I would make a request that policing does everything it can do to reduce detention times to the minimum possible. And I know that work can be achieved there. The Met did some great work on child detention using what they call the kind of golden hour child approach, where they've reduced detention times by like 50% by getting everyone lined up in the first hour. It's incredible work that they did. So I think we've got to meet in the middle. I don't think anyone's ever going to fund us to be with you for 10 or 12 hours. But if you can bring detention times down, down to 6 hours, and we can lift it up to 6 hours, then we can do kind of more kind of full coverage. I think whether people are paid or whether they're volunteers, it's about respecting their time and not just seeing them as a thing you need at certain points of the process, but having a role kind of throughout it. But that would be the issue that we probably get raised with us the most.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question from Joanna Egan. Thank you for the question. So the training that has been recently delivered to AAs, is this something we can share so that we're aware of what's being delivered in police training? It would be helpful to know what the training or content material is.
Yeah, okay, so let's cover that. If I go back to sharing the website, things are never quite as simple as you'd want them to be, but I will explain it. So on the training page on our website, you can see details of what the training involves, feedback, etc., etc. It's called the National Training Course. So you can definitely share that with people. We've obviously shared it with our members and repeatedly do. The complication is it's not free, because we have to have some income to be able to run the organisation, basically. And as I said, we're currently operating the charity on about £200,000 a year for full coverage of everything, and training's part of our income. And to be honest, I don't want to be completely dependent on the government for funding, because if they give it, they can take it away, and they can put pressure on you to not necessarily say the things that you want to say. So it does cost money. I'm pleased to say that I think within the next couple of months, we'll have about 60 local authorities covered with organisations that are providing for children, certainly. I'm not so sure on adults. It basically works out at about £72 a person, the training, and it's about 10 or 12 hours worth of training. I think it's not unreasonable in terms of pricing. So yes, it's there, and obviously almost all AA schemes will be members of ours and will know about it. But there's details of what it covers certainly on the website. And if any forces are interested, then come let me know. One of the things that's in my head is there a course that's, the AA role for police officers, that's a much shorter kind of condensed course that just kind of packages up the key messages, although I'm also, again, realistic about how much time you guys actually off work to do training, which is not enough.
Yes, no, thank you, Chris. We've got one hand up. I think we're going to bring them in to see if they want to ask a question as well. That's Martin O'Neill. I think we're just going to bring him onto the chat now.
Thank you, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thanks, Martin.
Sorry, I'm a custody sergeant, Greater Manchester Police, and I don't know if you heard, in terms of over the last couple of years, we've had a massive increase in the number of arrests coming through to put a lot of pressures on the custody suite as a whole. One thing I noticed, and whether it's a question or observations, but obviously in terms of when they come in, in terms of the understanding of when an AA needs to be allocated, I feel a lot of my newer colleagues, it's almost like a tick box exercise. They will see autism, they will see other types of issues, and they will automatically impose an AA. So in terms of experience and being able to actually understand the allocation of it, because I know that sometimes, whether you believe it is a subjective or an objective thing, whether you impose an AA, or say impose or offer the services of an AA to somebody, because obviously as well, sometimes someone will downright refuse the services of an AA. The other thing as well is obviously in terms of the times of arrest that some people are bringing people in, we're finding quite a big pressure on Like you say, we have a scheme that we use that post 11 o'clock. It's, you might as well not attempt it. So obviously that puts pressures on the decision to refuse. Can they be an alternative to detention? Can you bring them back at a time when you can facilitate interview, etc.? So I appreciate in terms of limited resources, it's difficult to put pressures on you guys to say, can you run a 24/7 service? And like I say, we do have a good working relationship with RAAs in terms of how we engage with them. But I feel like they're getting a lot of the pressures that we have. And I think one, from the understanding, the general training, like you say, as custody sergeants, their decision making. Because unfortunately, living in a world now where we're working with objectives that are set by senior SLT, and it's putting a pressure on decision-making abilities of some of the lesser, some of the lower ranks, from PCs upwards, because they're finding a lot of their decision-making powers are being driven by directives from above. They're just a few observations I have, especially from the AA perspective.
And just a brilliant set of things. So I will try and briefly just add to each of those. So yeah, I mean, I heard of a case recently where a custody officer got a phone call from a superintendent in another part of the organisation, and basically said, if you don't authorise that detention, it's the end of your career, son. And I think there is a failure to understand the importance and authority of that custody sergeant role and its independence from the rest of policing. And I've said this, and it's been, I don't know how controversial this is, but essentially, if policing, if custody can't be allowed to do what it does functionally, then custody probably has to come away from policing. If the rest of policing is going to impose itself in that way, the services should be 24 hours. It's as simple as that. That doesn't necessarily mean that an AA is always going to enable an interview in the middle of the night if they think that the person can't effectively participate. But when I hear we don't provide AAs after this time because you shouldn't interview a child after this time, my question is always, which child? What's their sleep-wake cycle? How do you know that particular child can't participate at that time? The problem for the providers is they're dependent on the specification and the funding they get from whoever's commissioning it. That's the challenge. I do think on authorization of detention, the data suggests that 99% of detentions are authorized, which either means that arresting officers are only arresting people who absolutely need to be arrested, or maybe can be a bit of a rubber stamp. I do think that in some forces, custody's got it in terms of detention not always being necessary for the investigation, but there are people at the tops of police forces who perhaps see arrest as a metric of success when it's not. It's a thing that happens or doesn't happen according to what's necessary to keep the public safe or for the prompt and effective investigation. On your point about officers having the confidence to decide around AAs, it's complex. So first of all, you said about people refusing them. There's nothing in PACE that says that a person can refuse to have an appropriate adult. What 1.4 says in Code C is, if there's any reason to suspect, you have to make reasonable efforts, first of all, to work out if there's any reason to suspect. And then if there is any reason to suspect the person may be vulnerable, then the appropriate adult measure applies. Those are the rules handed down by the system. So those are the rules we've got to work with. And that's kind of what I mean about not triaging. On the other hand, and it's also my point about lack of training, and I hope those videos help explain some of it, because it is true that someone could have a mental health issue and be able to participate effectively. However, my question to you is, what are you actually being asked to do by Code C? Are you being asked to work out whether that person's mentally vulnerable, or are you being asked to determine whether there's a reason to suspect that there may be? And my argument is it's completely unreasonable to ask the custody team to work out whether someone is PACE vulnerable or not. You would need Professor Gisley Good-Johnson, team of psychiatrists, 4 hours, 5 hours, 2 days, a week to work out whether someone actually can participate or not. And that's completely unreasonable. And that's kind of what I mean by giving you a tool that means you ask a set of questions that provides a set of information that means when you are brought to court to explain why you didn't provide an AA, and that's why the evidence is now potentially inadmissible. You've got a defensible. I don't believe in computers taking over the decision, but I do think that you need more support, and I hope those videos go a little tiny way towards that. And also the NPCC's working group on risk assessment, which I think risk assessment gets taken really seriously, but it's seen through the lens of physical risk, and those aren't the only risks you guys are holding. You're also holding these psycho-legal risks about whether the person's participation was good enough for the evidence to be admissible at court.
That's great, thank you. Like I say, I know it's not about, them refusing, but I appreciate it does sometimes impact your thinking if someone's downright saying, you're basically, it's almost like insinuating you're talking down to me type thing that I don't understand, etc., etc. So it feeds into your thought process. And like you're saying, the difficulty thing from a custody sergeant is you almost have to play amateur psychologist in the role. You almost have to sort of take that, you sort of take it on unwillingly, unknowingly sometimes, and it's a difficult one to put in when you get a lot of things that you're trying to play into.
It's another great example. Another great example of you guys taking on functions that the system doesn't actually allow for, but in practice makes you do, or like forces you to do. And I kind of want to say, fine, if that's what you want me to do, give me all the training and qualifications and support that I need to make that decision. But if you don't want me to make that decision, or rather, if you don't give me that, then I'm not going to make those kind of decisions. So I think it's really, I think you're in a really, really difficult position, which is why I respect that role so much. But yeah, one of the things we could do is change the name of the role from appropriate adult, particularly for adults. I think you're right that it almost comes across like you're saying the person's childlike in some way, and then they get insulted and then they kind of get upset as a result of it, which is not helpful. But between the skilled communication of the AA and the skilled communication of the custody officer, it can be explained in a way that's less offensive. I need to get you an AA because you're mentally vulnerable is different to there's a law that says I now have to impose the AA safeguard on myself or on the officers investigating because of the answers you've given. So it's not about you, it's about I have to do my job properly, is the way I would generally approach it, but tricky.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much, Phil, speaking. I know you're going to stay. We have a couple more questions, which we'll keep to the end, if that's all right. I think I've got one from Phil. We'll keep that to the end just so we've got some questions to ask at the end, and we can move on to our next speaker for the moment.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and thanks again, Chris. We'll speak to you shortly at the end. So we move on to the next item now on our little agenda, and it's the evolving role of professional standards. And this is going to be taken by Anton Menzies from the College of Policing. And hopefully we're going to hear now how the College of Policing is supporting the existing and continuing role, existing and continuing professionalisation of the custody role. So, Anton, if you'd like to take us into the next section, please.
Can you hear me? I didn't hear that last bit, Steve.
We can hear you, Anton. Over to you.
Oh, brilliant. Lovely. Thank you. Chris Bath is always a very, very tough act to follow because Chris is such a wonderful speaker, and he's also a critical friend of mine. But I always enjoy listening to Chris talk and deliver his speeches. And I will probably touch on a couple of things that Martin raised in my delivery. So hey, thank you for having me, and again, just to kind of echo Chris's words, thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule. Some of you who are working in custody are probably in the suites this morning, surveying what's in and dealing with the immense amount of challenges and pressure that you're facing at the moment. So it's a privilege to be here. I am a police officer of 22 years service. It feels like 22 minutes, but please do not make any assumption that I am a custody expert, because I really am not. I've just worked in custody for many years as a custody officer, I was even, you can't even use the word jailer anymore, can you? I was a jailer when I was a probationary constable many, many years ago. I've been a PACE inspector. I've been a governance lead, a policy writer, policy manager, and dare I say, even a temporary head of custody in South Yorkshire, which is where I came from, over to the college in January of last year. So it's been 12 months. So when I saw this opportunity, and those of you on the call will fondly remember Tony Maggs, who had this role before me, and when Tony retired and this role was advertised and feeling the way I do about police custody, like Chris, I am incredibly passionate about it, and I'm also very, very proud to say that I worked in custody and continue to work in custody. I'm also incredibly proud of the people that I worked with, and I'm also incredibly proud of the people who worked for me and continue to work in custody. So, a huge thank you to all of you who stepped up to work in this incredibly challenging space in policing. And I do feel the pressures that you're under, and I've experienced them myself. So the issues that Martin raised, I was kind of smiling a little bit, because not through anything else other than the fact that I sympathise wholeheartedly. But I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the things that I've been doing. So I've been asked today to talk about custody updates, so particularly around the evolving role of professional standards in custody. So if I may, I am going to take you through a PowerPoint. So contrary to what Chris did around delivering a presentation, I am going to take you. So those of you who are PowerPoint fans, strap yourselves in. I'm about to share my screen. So if you can see that, can you let me know? Can you see that, James? Yeah. Lovely. Right. So I'm just going to take you over the points I'm going to cover around the Centre for Police Productivity, the Custody Hydra, which is an exciting program that I've had a lot of involvement in. A bit of work around what I do around HMIC and the peer reviews I do, and also the themes that are coming from recent inspections. The ongoing APP review, how we're supporting statutory change, how I support forces myself, especially chief officers. They're a very, very distinct target audience. General learning and development. I'm also going to talk about accreditation through all the custody officer, and finish, if I may, with a bit on AI around the future. So if I can start by just covering the Centre of Police Productivity. So those of you may know that the Home Office did a big piece of work last year. I think it was an 18-month project to look at productivity across policing, of which obviously custody did feature. The team went to lots of forces, spent an incredible amount of time looking at how forces work, how officers work, the delegation of time, task, and they came back and they've made 206 recommendations for policing to improve productivity, and I've pulled out the 5 that relate to custody. Now, what the Home Office then did when those recommendations were published is they made the decision that there should be a national centre for police productivity, and that would be situated in the College of Policing. It was established about 6 months ago with Rachel Tuffin taking the directorship role, with some funding from the Home Office to set up the centre, and we are currently in the first year of delivery. I do not work in the Police Productivity Centre, even though I talk about it a great deal, but I do have direct influence over the 5 recommendations for custody. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a flavour about what we're going to be targeting. The first is obviously the duty solicitor scheme. Now, those of you on the call will know that getting or securing the attendance of a solicitor is incredibly challenging. I remember fondly one of my detention officers in South Yorkshire coming into my office almost in tears because she'd spent nearly an hour waiting in the queue to get a reference number to book a duty solicitor for a detainee. The productivity team have looked at this, and they've identified the fact that the duty solicitor scheme is in dire need of review, and I am currently working with the Law Society to look at some remedial action about how to improve that scheme and the process to make life easier for you. So that's one particular project. They identified that performance reporting in general is inadequate across custody. So when you look at performance data, and I'm one of those people that generally believes that performance data is really, really critical, particularly when you're comparing yourselves against other forces and benchmarking, looking at what good performance actually looks like. It's astounding to think that many forces don't have any performance reporting for custody at all. So that's another piece of work that I am supporting forces with at the moment. There's some really, really good dashboards and performance metrics being made at the moment. They looked at the process, the general process. Now, this one is really, really interesting one, because what they have said is that they have said that police staff could be more productive in terms of the deployment of staff. And I had a really good sit-down chat with a team that wrote this recommendation to kind of delve into a little more detail, because as we know, that custody is incredibly challenging. It's very, very busy, and when it is busy, it becomes almost like a cauldron of risk. But nevertheless, they have said that that forces should look at the deployment of their staff in order to improve productivity. And one of the examples that they gave was that they were seeing detention officers being given particular roles like biometrics, and when none of the detainees were being put into the biometrics room, having their bios taken, that they were scrolling on their phones, not being usefully deployed in other areas to assist their colleagues on the wings. That just gives you a bit of a flavour of what the team saw. So they've made this recommendation that forces should look at the productivity, particularly around the deployment of staff. They've recognised that there is a dire need for a deep dive review of police powers in relation to codes C and G, and that's a Home Office recommendation, and that's something that is going to be taking place very, very soon. Particularly for custody. And interestingly, the last one around VA, that voluntary attendance is significantly underused in parts of the country. Now, this is an interesting one, because the NPCC guidance for VA was only released back in July of last year. Ben Martin from, and I think Chris I don't know if you were involved in that work, Chris. I know that many stakeholders were involved in that piece of work around formulating that guidance, but we do now have a VA policy at NPCC level, and the Home Office productivity team have said that VA could be more utilised to prevent unnecessary detentions and people coming into custody unnecessarily, and to use it as a investigation tactic. So those are the 5 recommendations for custody, and I'm supporting particularly points 2 and 3 as we move forward. The next bit is around the custody Hydra. So I think many of you on the call may have actually done the training yourselves. So the Hydra training came in January 2022. Now, it came about, which is something I'm going to touch on later, on accreditation. Nev Kemp, the portfolio holder for custody, as you all know, he took a paper to Chiefs Council in 2019 to make a formal request that custody becomes a national, the training becomes national, and the Chiefs voted against it. So one of the trade-offs after that decision was that the Home Office asked the college to produce a national Hydra package for the management of vulnerability. As Chris highlighted, that there is a bit of a knowledge gap in relation to the knowledge of vulnerability, and I've seen this myself. I don't expect officers to know the definition verbatim because it's a very long one, but the Hydra package was made to improve and enhance people's knowledge of vulnerability in custody. So to date, we've had 33 forces have either commenced or completed the training, which is a really, really good return. We estimate, that's not a guaranteed number, we estimate from the figures that we've been supplied with so far that 2,500 officers have completed and staff have completed the training. We're now in the evaluation phase, so and that's just about to finish. So we've sent out some surveys, and again, some of you on the call may have completed these. If you did, thank you ever so much, because 841 submissions is really, really good. So we sent out a survey to all participants, asking what their general understanding was of vulnerability and how confident they felt that they could manage a vulnerable detainee in custody. The early evidence suggests, and we did it again after the training, and the early evidence suggests that the training has made a positive impact. But of course, we won't know the full results until the evaluation's complete. Five Forces have kindly stepped forward to work with us to assess custody records and CCTV footage, because we felt that obviously to see the impact of the training, we need to start looking at custody records. So putting your information governance aside, we've looked at over 700 records, redacted records that is, from Five Forces, a mixture of metropolitan and more rural forces, and we've looked at 300 hours of CCTV. Now the CCTV footage was something that I do take a bit of credit for, because I think initially the research team wanted to look purely at custody records, and I said, having been in custody myself, you need to look at the footage alongside some of those examples if you are going to score a record as being low in terms of the management of vulnerability. I said there will have been things that the custody officer will have done but may not necessarily be recorded on the record, but they will have asked the question, and that's been really, really beneficial. So we've looked at over 300 hours of CCTV, and of course we've interviewed custody staff in those Five Forces. So we're just completing the data and the scoring at the moment, and we're looking to complete the draft report to Sir Andy Marsh for April. That should read 2025, by the way. That's a typo on my part, so I do apologise. That's February this year, with completion of the report to Mr. Marsh in April 25. It will then be assessed by the College's Evaluation Board, and we will send a publication to Ivan Balhatchett and the MPCC leads shortly afterwards. And dare I say, we may decide to write the sequel. So one of the things that has really shone from the vulnerability Hydra package is that officers would like to do a PIP module on that, where a detainee does become non-responsive and we run a PIP style Hydra bolt-on. That's something that we will look at maybe writing later this year, depending on how the evaluation goes. So that's a bit of a rundown of the Hydra. This is something that I really enjoy. I'm having to scale back a little bit because of work and demand, but one of the things I enjoy doing are HMIC peer reviews, and there are some forces who I've got on my list of areas to target and come to. So I'm not affiliated with HMIC in any way, shape or form, but I do use their framework. And I even contributed recently to their review of their inspection framework, because as we all know, they've made the decision to bring custody inspections into Peel later this year, where custody will form part of that. So I don't know, that is a piece of work that's been quite tough for me, because I'm not a huge supporter of their new framework, but that's work that we're doing with the Home Office at the moment. So I've done 8 forces. I've done 8 visits since January of last year. A variety of different bits of feedback, but one of the things I love about doing HMIC peer reviews is it's not an inspection, it's a peer review, so it's almost like a coaching intervention. So I bring packets of biscuits and tea and coffee, and I sit with custody officers, and I really enjoy the conversations and the banter that I have with them, and I just basically look at what they're doing and how they're doing things, and I give them a bit of a report on areas to target. I also tell them where they are performing really, really well. Chief Officer debrief is always really interesting, because one thing that has become really, really apparent is that there are some forces who have that strategic buy-in at Chief Officer level, and their Chief Officers really, really care and are heavily invested in what goes on in the day-to-day runnings of custody. Regrettably, there are others that don't. So I do like to get into Chief Officer teams and to talk about what's going on in their suites, and to kind of encourage them to take a daily interest in what's going on in the suites, and also to support staff and staff's well-being, because that's really, really key. If you do want me to come and do a peer review, please make contact. I do have a bit of a waiting list, but I do like to come. Pre-HMIC is best, because it allows me to help you prep, but I am supporting forces with post-inspection reports. So having digested the recent HMIC reviews from many forces, these are, I think, the 5 common areas that I've seen, and also from my own visits. And interestingly, the storage of reading material, particularly foreign language and religious material, is one that keeps cropping up as being either an area of concern or an area for improvement. Simple things like the storage of religious material on the same level, A to Z. I went to one force and the religious material was stuffed in a photocopier box or behind the photocopier, and no one could find it, and I found it for them when a detainee asked for it. So, it's little things like that, to kind of get on top of before HMIC come, because they will pull you up for it. The issue of foreign language material was something that came up, and I did send out something last year around foreign language material, because obviously it's very, very difficult to secure foreign language reading material. But what I've encouraged forces to do is to simply ring publishers directly, and like Penguin and Hodder and Stoughton and any other publication, they will send you text in foreign languages. So if you pinpoint through your performance data the common languages, whether it be Polish, Romanian, or Pashto, there are they can order and send you material in any language that you want. So that's that one around the storage of material. The big one for me is use of force, particularly around the recording of use of force on the custody record. So what they have found, and forces continue to get pulled up on this, is that there is a disparity between what's recorded on the use of force form and what's on the custody record. So what they will do is they will pull away 20 use of force reports from the use of force forms system in your force, and then they will look at the time the force was used, and then they will come and ask the custody officer or the inspector or the team supporting the inspection to show them the custody record for that incident. So if Anton Menzies was if force was used on me in the biometrics room, for example, at 10:30 on a particular day, they will expect an entry on the custody record in or around that time, even if it's a late entry. As we know, custody's busy. For custody officers and staff are not always recording use of force on the custody record, and we're not expecting war and peace. They're just looking for an acknowledgement that force has been used, the detainees safe and well, and also the staff are safe and well as well. So again, my kind of plea to the custody officers on the call is if you can, is to be professionally curious, and if you see, hear or know of force being used, make sure there's entry on the custody record, because HMIC will pull you up on it. The third is the maintenance of the custody estate. So one of the things I look at, I sit on the MPEG, the National Police Estates Group, and I'm quite passionate about the maintenance of the custody estate, and I've had some very, very, very interesting conversations with senior leaders and estates directors around the poor state of the custody estate, and the fact that it's been neglected in some forces. So I kind of speak to them not only from the point of view of the detainee, and that actually custody can be traumatic, particularly for children, younger children especially, and women. And there's academic studies that support that the custody estate is something that should be invested in, and it should also be invested in for the benefit of the staff that work in there. And I've been into some suites where I've literally had quite words with custody staff saying, crikey, I don't think I could spend 12 hours in the suite that you work in because of the state that it's in. So I do voice my opinion and make it very, very well known to chief officers if I see evidence of poor maintenance and how to improve that. I also like to kind of see and look at the link between the operational and the strategic. So it comes back to the chief officer bit around, is there that strategic buy-in? Is custody part of the strategic objectives for the force? Does custody get mentioned in their objectives? And how does the operational delivery link into that? So one of the questions that I ask, and also HMIC ask, is of custody officers, is how do you know that you're delivering your force priorities? And regrettably, not many of them do, and I think that's a leadership issue. That's not being critical of the custody officers, but I do think that senior officers have a responsibility to make sure that everything that happens in custody feeds into the strategic parts of the business. And interestingly, on the 5th, I always like to ask the question, this is again my own professional curiosity around recruitment of custody. I've always said that being the most demanding, or one of the certainly most demanding role in policing, that, and I've seen it over the years, that when officers are sent there by way of punishment, they don't necessarily want to be there. And the question I ask is, are they the right people to look after the most vulnerable people in society and provide compassion and care and look after people? Or do we recruit custody officers in who want to progress and develop and become the PACE inspectors and police leaders of the future? And this was something that Nev Kemp was very, very passionate about. And I know that he wrote to Forces last year to make the request that, you know, that custody should not be viewed as a punishment post and as a place to routinely or easily put people because they're out of the way. That actually custody is one of the areas where you really need to make sure that you've got the right people in there for the right reasons. And HMIC do pick up on that as well. Chris will support me with this, and Chris is supporting me with this. So it may not surprise all of you that APP is in a bit of state of disrepair at the moment. I make no there's no getting away from that. One of the things I looked at even before I came here was that I think that APP needs a deep dive review. It's been in existence since 2012. It's one of the first APPs that came in from the college, and I think we're now up to 36 APPs. It's not had a deep dive review since 2015, and that's a long time. So we're now 10 years since that last deep dive review was completed, and since then we've had 76 I call tweaks and updates to APP. Some of those have been done by my good self in terms of broken links and some small amendments, but I think because it's had 76 different mechanics and tweaks to the car's not probably driving and flowing as easy as it could do, so it doesn't read brilliantly, and I don't think it's structured very well. So excuse the pun around the Avengers, I invited colleagues and stakeholders, of which Chris is a member, into a meeting back in October of last year, where we looked at how we're going to do this and break up the topics, and we met recently at a second meeting in late January to discuss the possible terms of reference and the pathway forward about how we're going to do it, because I cannot write APP on my own or review it on my own. I could, but I would much rather get colleagues and staff involved who can help me do that, and Chris is definitely part of that. We're looking to restructure the content to make it more user friendly and to make key topics more prominent, and just to reassure you all, the Federation do have a role in that, and James will be invited to the next meeting because the Federation input to that APP review is crucial, and we're looking to complete this draft for the Chief Exec in later this year. Currently supporting statutory changes to PACE, of which there is a lot of work ongoing at the moment in the Home Office with the PACE Strategy Board, the next meeting next week, for proposed changes to Code C, particularly around strip searching, around providing that clarity and to make it easier for custody staff to apply those principles. Which we're involved in relation to learning and development, the custody curriculum, which you can find on the college. Now, I do apologise profusely for this, because the curriculum is very, very difficult to navigate and actually find, but it's on the College Learn, and if you would like some assistance, I'm going to put something on the Knowledge Hub, because I was supporting a sergeant just the other day on how to find it, because it is very, very difficult to find, but unfortunately I can't influence or change that. But we constantly look at updating the custody curriculum, which enables you to structure your training courses around that accordingly. I like to deliver training myself, and I've opened custody courses and now opening custody courses in over 10 forces now. I think my next one is in Lincolnshire next month, and this again is something that I really, really enjoy doing, around welcoming new people to the world of custody, and talk about the things that I think make good custody around leadership, and professional curiosity. So that's something I enjoy doing, and I support academic research. I'm supporting over six pieces of work at the moment, from various universities, institutions, and I would encourage particularly the inspectors and the policy writers and the force leads to really tap into that academic cohort in your force areas. There are many scattered around England and Wales, and we've got some brilliant academics working on your doorstep. So please look at what's going on in your local institutions. A bit of a sales pitch for me around Knowledge Hub. We've got a custody group on Knowledge Hub. I know it's a bit of a nightmare to get in because you need the accreditator app on your phone, but once you get through that and you're into Knowledge Hub, the custody channel I reinvigorated about 6 months ago. I'm a facilitator on that now. We've now grown to 177 members, and that's a brilliant, or what commonly known as the old poker community. We've got officers doing benchmark requests, talking to each other, sharing good practice. I've built up a really, really good library of information, of which some of Chris's material is on there around the NARN standards. So if you're not a member of the Knowledge Hub channel, where have you been? And please join. Finishing off with accreditation. So one of the things that we are looking at the college now, Nev tried to get accreditation through the Home Office, through the NPCC Home Office in 2019 to officially accredit the role of the custody officer, and I have always supported this. And the reason I do is because of the following reasons. One is because of the significant responsibility on the shoulders and the decisions that custody officers make. And what we would like to see with accreditation is mandatory, consistent training from the centre, like the college, like the firearms and taser courses, to provide consistency and improve standards where required, because as it stands at the moment, forces are responsible for individualised delivery of custody in their force. And I have seen some significant changes in the delivery and indeed the content in many forces, and I'm supporting forces who do training reviews around that. And of course, accreditation gives you that mandatory training where everybody is trained on the same content, and it's something that the IOPC, everybody, the coroner's inquiries from deaths and serious injuries in custody, all comes back to training. And one of the things that accreditation gives is that mandatory consistent training from the centre, where we will bring the trainers in, we will look at the mandatory topics and ask them to go back out to forces and train it, and then there'll be some localised bolt-ons on top of that. In addition to that, we'll be looking at CPD pathways. So I did my custody training in the Met in 2006. I have not been on a single custody course since. One of the things that I'm also passionate about is that custody officers and staff should have access to mandatory CPD inputs throughout the year to keep people appraised at what's going on, the things that are affecting custody, and also what's on the horizon. I think that's really, really important. And the fitness to practice phrase comes from the principle that in order to achieve and maintain your accreditation, you have to complete CPD initial training in order to maintain your skill sets to work in custody. We're considering bolting an external qualification into that, and the fact that everybody I've spoken to so far is supportive of accreditation. I've had no opposition whatsoever, but if anybody does oppose it or would like to discuss it, more than happy. And the last around AI. Last April, I began building a chatbot for custody staff with a solutions architect from the BTP, who is about to come into the college to successfully deliver this project. So in essence, there are 182 reference points built into this AI tool where this will sit as it stands, and that's a screenshot of the system in play, where you will ask AI a question about custody or charging, and the AI facility will help answer the question, which should theoretically allow you to make better decisions and also to access information more quickly. So I've demonstrated this now several times. I think the Federation are due a demonstration, aren't we, James, very, very soon. But the feedback so far has been really, really positive, and we are looking to go out to Greater Manchester and the BTP in April to trial this for 3 months to see the impact, and then looking at a wider rollout later this year. So that, in a nutshell, is what's going on around custody from the college. And my hashtag, just to kind of echo what Chris has said, is a huge thank you again to all that you do, and for the challenging environment and roles that you perform. It's, you know, credit to all of you. So thank you from me. Happy to take any questions. Be gentle.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you for joining us today as well. I think we do have a question from Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Anton. As you know, I'm a guest facilitator, but my day role here in the Federation is one of the ops policing leads, so it sits across custody and a number of other areas. So naturally, when you mention post-incident procedure, it very much tweaks my attention. And then to go on and mention the APP being in a, you know, perhaps charitably described as a bit of a state of disrepair. I just was wondering, what prompted you to consider including a PIP module in your Hydra work?
I think it was feedback from delegates, Steve. As you know, the Hydra takes you through an immersive learning where you're operating in a custody suite with vulnerable detainees, with different vulnerabilities on show. And interestingly, when the plenary session was completed to finish the delivery of the day, lots of students put their hands up and said, what would happen if that detainee was to die? What would happen? And interestingly, my staff said this in South Yorkshire, Steve, when I was talking, when we restructured the training there, that there is an appetite for officers to be exposed to PIP. And I think it's really, really important not to scare them in any way, shape or form, but to kind of give them a flavour of what that process looks like and what would happen and why it happens. Because having, you know, and even those on the call who may have been involved in a death or a serious injury where they've gone through either a full PIP process or maybe a PIP light, it can be quite traumatizing. It can be quite challenging, and of course the Federation play a critical role in that. So it's come from my own professional curiosity, but it's also come from the feedback from delegates who have actually said we would like to see this. So it's a concept that, again, we're happy to work on, and we are looking at a bolt-on later this year, depending on the feedback and the evaluation. I would like to write a sequel with other stakeholders to give officers and staff a flavour of what that PIP process will look like.
I think you're spot on there. Knowledge is definitely power when it comes to post-incident, and there's a lot of myth and fear circulating in that world that's unnecessary once you get the knowledge and the confidence to deal with what needs to be dealt with. So I think that's an interesting bolt-on to the work you're doing. Thanks, Anton.
It's really good, and myself as a PIP rep within the Met, I mean, getting the knowledge around PIP certainly would. It's something that I'm very passionate about, something that I'm trying to bring in within the MPS at the moment, is increasing that knowledge around DSIs and PIPs to support staff when that happens. Because it's always 2 o'clock in the morning, isn't it, when there's no one to advise you. So to have that knowledge it just gives you a little bit more reassurance. Accreditation is something that's really interesting as well. And I've seen some of the AI that we've discussed in the past around for forces that have got Connect. There's add-ons being looked at the moment in order to reduce the calls coming in to assign and give information to solicitors, for example. So there's some really good AI stuff coming out as well that I know you're working on. So thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions, but I'll go back to a message from Phil Ince earlier on, and this is for Chris. So a big problem we have in TVP are the actual numbers of local authority trained AAs. Are you finding this as a national problem, and are you actively seeking to increase those numbers?
TVP has consistently been one of the most difficult areas, because it's an area where local authorities haven't really maybe wanted to engage with commissioning or providing the service. As I say, what's happened in other areas is that police and crime commissioners have often, or combined authorities in the case of GMP and soon to be West Yorkshire, I think, have kind of stepped into that breach. Is an interesting question around. It's still policing, but it's not the police force. In terms of there is a particular TVP problem I think you're experiencing, but as I say, there's a broader national issue, which is partly around nobody being responsible for it, partly about it not really being subject to inspection and accountability, partly in relation to it's become very difficult to recruit volunteers post COVID. A lot of people stopped then and didn't come back. A lot of older people for health reasons, but also the economy means that a lot of people who were previously giving their time up for free have been forced to, go back to work to earn a crust to keep money in the heating meter. So that's difficult. And as I say, on the paid side, the sessional workers, it's becoming increasingly difficult for the schemes to pay people enough money to attract them to those roles. It's not done properly. It's not an easy role. Custody is a difficult place to work in. You're working with difficult people. As alluded to earlier on, sometimes you can turn up and the person can kind of want to scream in your face about the fact they don't even want you there. It's a skilled and difficult kind of job. So yes, we are doing work. We're asking ministers to legislate for it to be statutory provision for on somebody to provide AAs, somebody who isn't a police force to provide AAs. We are actively working with commissioners to explain to them that there's a lot of commissioners out there. I don't mean police and crime commissioners. I mean anybody commissioning these services. They don't actually understand what they're commissioning because it's not what they do. So we're helping them with information about how you specify an appropriate adult service that's actually what's needed, how you fund it appropriately. We've had cases where people have started with certain budget and we've had to have a conversation with them that kind of doubles the budget. But yeah, there are things outside of my power, sadly, and one of them is changing the law. Another one is getting lots of money involved. What I would say, we've had some success. The Met recently, as in I think last week or the week before, the Mayor announced £5.4 million worth of funding to, for the first time ever, there to be one organising mind commissioning appropriate adult services for vulnerable adults across the Met, and that's a significant amount of money. And it's sort of set in place for 3, 4, 5 years. So that's good. We are doing what we can, but again, 3-person charity, limited ability, unfortunately.
Thanks, Chris. Just a reminder for people on the call, if you do want to ask questions, please stick them in the chat box and they'll come through to us on the system here. Use the email, the events email that's been circulated, or the QR code. But just while we're gathering those questions in, we heard earlier on Chris described police officers as natural problem solvers, which I think is a description most of us would recognise. Martin went on to say we're amateur psychologists. So, Anton, considering the pride in custody that you rightfully hold and that hopefully many on the call hold, do you think the label of amateur psychologist, do you think it's a welcome accolade, or is it a warning sign?
Absolutely a warning sign. The authentic side of me, and as a leader in custody, and I did used to get involved heavily to support my custody officers around the fact that resources are stretched, and when you've got a detainee who is in a position of trauma and they're in crisis, and that's a debilitating environment for a detainee to be in. It's also debilitating and traumatic for the staff because custody officers care, and we all know that police custody is not the right place for a detainee. So I take a very, very dim view that custody is the place for people to be kept. They should be treated accordingly in the appropriate environment, but we know that those beds are not as readily available as required. So that has theoretically placed police custody officers in the position where you refer to as becoming amateur psychologists, where we are stuck with the problem. And I used to quite enjoy escalating these issues with senior managers, and I would encourage any custody officer, PACE inspector on this call to use their power and influence to respectfully challenge and hold people accountable when required. And that goes for anything in custody. It goes back to the superintendent issue that Chris highlighted earlier, and I spoke to that superintendent directly. Take one thing from this input. Please do not sit there and suffer and allow the disingenuity or the lack of provision deter you from doing the right thing, and to make those phone calls and to escalate, document on the custody record what you've done and why you've done it. And you know what? I have taken great pride over the years in supporting every custody officer that's worked for me in doing that very thing. It's a sad state of affairs, Steve, but we've got to escalate and hold those people accountable. If we don't, the system, in my view, will never change, and we've got to do it. We've got to do something. We've got to do the right thing, because we've got to remember that we've got really vulnerable people in our cells. There's a human in that cell who is suffering, and we've got a duty of care to help them. And that includes having those necessary phone calls with the right people, Steve. So I do not like the fact that custody officers are becoming amateur psychologists, because that's not their role.
Yeah.
They're there to have an understanding of vulnerability. But when we talk about, custody is a specialist profession, but mental health is an additional layer of speciality that takes years to qualify. We're not equipped to do that. We're not equipped to make these decisions. That's for other people to, like the healthcare professional. My job as a custody officer is to say, here is an issue, over to you. This is where you earn your mettle. So support me and I'll support you. And that's the stance I've always taken on this, Steve. And I would encourage custody officers, and I sympathise wholeheartedly, but you know what? Speak out. In a respectful way, of course. Speak out and have those conversations and escalate, because you'll never be criticised for doing that. And if you are, you let me know.
Yeah. Or of course your local Fed as well.
Or your local Fed rep as well. And I had a great relationship with my Fed in Steve Kent in South Yorkshire, and that's what they're there for. Have these conversations and use your reps to have that voice, and we should not be doing these things.
Yeah, thanks for that, Anton. I think that's a nice note to end on.
We've got one more.
Oh, go on. Sorry,
one very quick question from Rachel Fletcher in Northumbria. This may be for both of you and all of us, but how are we preparing for the new NPCC guidance for searching transgender detainees, which apparently is due on the 19th of March, and how do you think this will change things for custody officers?
Well, on this very, very point, Chris, being a critical friend, has supported me with my own thoughts on this. It's an incredibly sensitive topic, and the guidance has been sent for legal advice, and that the way I see it is that you kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. The position I take on this as an interim has always been this. You can only deal with what's in front of you as a custody officer. Compassion, yes. Respect, yes. Dignity, absolutely. Work with the detainee and be respectful in the way that you would treat anybody. I don't think the guidance will necessarily solve the problem. In fairness, particularly from what I've read, and I can't speak in depth about the content of it because it's redacted and it's under, I'm not allowed to. But it's a great question. I would like to think that guidance will come out, but I think there will still be questions arising from that when it is published. But like I said before, as an interim measure, as a diligent custody officer that I know everybody on this call is, work with the detainee like you would do with anybody else. Don't work against them, because I think that is the issue when you start enforcing things on detainees against, in relation to strip searching and using force. Do so in the most dignified way that you can, because then you can't be criticised. You may be criticised, but at least you can say you were dignified and professional in the way that you dealt with it. So I don't necessarily think that the guidance will answer the question and solve the problem. I think that there is some statutory requirements involved, but that's all I can really say on the matter. We'll wait to see what it comes back with.
Yeah, and I would say I can't really comment on the guidance until it's published and we get the opportunity to. I have put a link in the chat that was to a report that I did a couple of years ago on PACE powers following the Child Q strip search without an appropriate adult. And I do cover sex, gender, trans issues in that. You've obviously got to follow the law. You've got to follow the PACE codes as interpreted. And I hope the message that comes across in that strip search report is that I worry that there's a bit of a dynamic about those on high make this set of rules for police officers. And if you don't use those powers to their full extent and something goes wrong, they can say, hey, look, we gave you these powers and you didn't use them. If you do use them and then something goes wrong and the media thing kind of blows up, then it's kind of, oh, well, we didn't mean you to use them like that. So in a sense, they're kind of they're quite protected from those kind of things. What I would say is that my view, we've got this problem with appropriate adults because Code C actually says that the sex of the appropriate adult has to match the sex of the detained person. And generally we've got, I don't know, maybe 80% women in the AA workforce, 20% men. So strip searching women shouldn't actually be too much of an issue. But as far as I can work out, systemically, you're not asking for the same sex AAs for strip searches, and we're not providing it. And if you did ask us for it, we wouldn't be able to do it. So between us, we're systematically breaching PACE at the moment. Final thing I'd say on it is, I think that they set those rules in an overly simplistic way. The sex thing, Annex L is different to the rest of the codes, which doesn't really help. But essentially it's saying, oh, the way we'll deal with issues of dignity is we'll just match sex, and that's all we have to do. And I think that's massively overly simplistic. What if I'm a 13-year-old boy that spent the last year being sexually assaulted by his uncle, and now I'm in police custody, and you're saying you have to be strip searched by men in the presence of men? Is that for my dignity? Is that for my mental health? Who's that kind of protecting? There's an interesting question there for me, which is, what are we trying to achieve here? We're arguing about this rule and that rule, and I think sometimes what gets lost is, what is the big picture? What are we actually trying to achieve here? Which I think is about dignity, it is about mental health, it's about keeping people safe. And I think that bends back to asking people what they feel most comfortable with. That is a practicable thing that can be done, is my view. But ultimately, you're going to have to follow whatever the rules say, and I can't control that.
Yeah, thank you. We're having a number of these webinars in the future. I think this was a subject area that's been considered for a future webinar. So it'd be interesting to go into a bit more detail with that in the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers, JJ. And whilst we're on the subject of thanks, if we could just extend our thanks to Chris Bath, the Chief Executive of the National Appropriate Adults Network, and also to Anton Menzies, the Senior Policy Manager for Custody at the College of Policing. Folks, thank you very much for sharing your extensive experience with us. No small amount of effort has gone into preparing your contributions today. We're very, very grateful. And through that same prism, listeners out there, if you could perhaps take the moment to share your feedback back with us. It's a gift. We'd love to hear from you. What's worked for you, what hasn't worked for you. Using the QR code there, that'll take you to a link. There's also a link in the chat. Just a couple of seconds, if you could take the time, let us know what you thought about how today went, so that we can use it to inform the next ones and continue delivering something hopefully you'll find useful. So
yeah, and any areas of policing or any areas of custody you think would be beneficial, for future webinars, anything you think you might want covered would be good as well.
So from the Custody Forum of the Federation, we thank you very much.